In the world of Fire Force, the 8 pillars of Adolla each had a vital role to play in triggering the apocalypse. But even when you've been chosen by God and have special fiery powers, it's still nice to have somebody you can rely on. That's why the pillars were followed around by guardians. Characters who could consistently match their freak and push them to their peak. And some of the guardians were even stronger than a few of the pillars. But interestingly, not every pillar had a guardian. The first pillar, Amaterasu, didn't have anyone for centuries, let alone a guardian. Yona was really the only one who interacted with her. But I don't think the alien from hell who abducted her is exactly guardian material. And even though she latched onto Shinra as a fellow pillar, he couldn't be her guardian. If anything, the power plant Amaterasu was trapped in would be her guardian. The 7th pillar, Sumire, didn't have a guardian either. Sumire was almost 300 years old, so maybe her guardian just couldn't last that long. After all, the concept of pillars having guardians does seem to be traditional. I actually think Hibana would have been an interesting guardian for the 7th pillar. Like Sumire said, flowers and bugs go hand in hand. As a kid, Hibana looked up to the old nun. She was a notably eager student who didn't just ask for answers. She actively sought them out herself. Her curiosity was just that great. And even despite her plans, Sumire was actually proud of Hibana's growth. So maybe if it wasn't for the whole sacrificing all her friends and turning them into child infernals thing, they could have been a good pair. But if not the guardian of the 7th pillar, then surely the 8th pillar, Hibana's sister Iris, could have been a solid fit. The fact that Iris was a pillar and a doppelganger was a late game twist. So between that and her dramatic death, there wasn't much time or need to give her a guardian. Although, since she was an outlier among outliers, maybe it's not too crazy to think that Iris's guardian was Fire Company 8 itself. But as for the official list, Charon was the guardian of the 2nd pillar, Haumea. He has the same name as the ferryman of Hades from Greek mythology, which is very fitting for someone who fought to bring hell to the world. Charon didn't hesitate to send innocent souls to the other side and was totally comfortable around dead bodies. Despite this, the big guy didn't hate anyone in the world. Charon is also the name of one of Pluto's moons, one of the largest trans-Neptunian objects in space, which is any minor planetoid in the solar system that orbits the sun at a greater average distance than Neptune, the furthest planet from the sun. This is interesting because aside from the sun and moon being a pretty big deal in this story, another one of the largest trans-Neptunian objects is named Haumea. Charon's birthday, June 22nd, is also the first time that the moon Charon was observed in 1978. Charon considered himself to be a super gorilla, and for good reason. This man was 6'7" and 287 pounds of mostly muscle with a size 17 foot. He is easily one of the most imposing figures in the series based on stature alone, while his ignition ability is easily one of the most impressive and the reason why he was called Charon the Reflector. It allowed Charon to absorb and store kinetic energy from anything that hit him. From there, he could turn the kinetic energy into thermal energy. Despite being a 2nd generation ability, it was so capable that it could easily be mistaken for a 3rd generation ability. The catch was that Charon couldn't absorb and use energy at the same time, so it was either offense or defense for him. There was also a limit to how much energy he could absorb in one go. So if Charon doesn't eventually release the energy he has stored, he runs the risk of eventually reaching critical mass and dying, which is exactly how he ended up dying. That said, in most cases, simply knowing Charon's weakness was useless. It took an absurd level of oppressive firepower to make this guy fold. Very few characters could even hope to push him that far. Charon could take a hit from just about anyone. From the outset of their first encounter, he was mopping the floor with Shinra. And at that, he took the pillar's empowered Hellfire attack straight to the face. An attack so exponentially powerful that even Inca was unsettled by its premonition. Yet Charon got back up in seconds with a smile on his face. He said that it was the first time someone had ever hurt him in his entire life. Even Benimaru, who might as well be the Gojo of Fire Force, said that Charon was freakishly strong. And despite his size, the big guy could move faster than normal people could process. To take his ignition ability even further, Kadon could freely move his internal energy to various parts of his body for different techniques. And since Kadon went 28 years without taking damage, he saw no problem with loudly announcing his techniques before he used them. First, there's Walk. By sending thermal energy to his feet, Kadon could create explosions with every footfall. And funny enough, the first time we saw Kadon use it, he was just flexing. He didn't attack or anything, he just walked closer, very menacingly. And for an immovable object, that's a pretty good intimidation tactic. And in the moment, it also doubled as a sign that told Hameya that he was in a fight. This technique boosted that crazy speed of his so much that Kadon was able to catch Shinra while he was mid-flight. And even without access to lightspeed movement at the time, Shinra was extremely quick back then. With Clap, Kadon sent thermal energy to his hands and could create explosive claps. And this move was a good space maker for him. And Snap was pretty much the less powerful yet quicker version of Clap. So yeah, by simply walking, snapping his fingers, and I guess clapping his hands, Kadon could easily defeat the overwhelming majority of characters in Fire Force. But when he was a bit more serious, Kadon used Stamp. Like with Clap and Snap, thermal energy was sent to his hands. Then he released a Kamehameha-style ball of energy. And that similarity is not just a coincidence. Kamehameha was the name of the late conqueror and first unifying ruler of the kingdoms of Hawaii. And Kamehameha the Great seems to have been a major inspiration behind Kadon's character and design. If you saw our Pillar video, then you'd know that Hameya is also the name of one of Hawaii's oldest and most significant gods. Kadon was a member of the White Clad from the age of at least 17 years old. He was a guardian longer than anyone else. Since he was paired with Hameya when she was so young, Kadon assumed a somewhat parental and somewhat brotherly relationship with her. She was pretty scary for a 3-year-old and had quite the potty mouth. So aside from causing the apocalypse, Kadon also wanted to raise Hameya to be ladylike. He even picked up a book on child rearing, although her mind reading made that effort totally useless. But apparently she once made him a boiled egg on a whim. And because it came from her, it was the best thing Kadon ever ate in his entire life. And this guy would eat just about anything. But more than anything, Kadon hated seeing Hameya suffer. In reality, Kadon's boast about Shinra being the first person to hurt him isn't entirely true. For Hameya's sake, Kadon allowed himself to be a punching bag. He didn't use his ability to protect himself at all, let her draw blood, and let it continue until she was satisfied. Kadon saw this as a way for him to understand even a bit of his pillar's pain. And at that, he knew more about her suffering than anyone else. Like the fact that even sleep was not an escape for her, since the emotions of everyone around her would leak in regardless. Kadon also covered his eyes like Hameya, but that was more of a white-clad tradition related to the sun. Even so, the blindfold didn't really have an impact on him in combat, since it was actually pretty see-through. But since Kadon was a father figure for his pillar, sometimes Hameya just couldn't stand to be around him. Although, since he could be so silly and slow mentally, he wasn't as hard for Hameya to be around as others. When Hameya read his mind to find out how he feels about her, the answer was as simple as him: unconditional love, which is why he was able to die for her with a smile on his face. A moment that truly broke the Saintess and was vital to the world's assimilation with Hell. The sense of responsibility Kadon felt as a guardian wasn't limited to just Hameya either. As a guardian, Kadon took pride in protecting all of the pillars, and he would die for each and every one of them without even a moment's hesitation. Hell, this man scarred the moon for them. This dedication to the White Clad's cause earned him a great deal of respect among the men under his command. They even called him Sire. There is no doubt that Kadon trained them very well. They weren't just a useless mob of NPCs. They were actually capable enough to pin Shinra. And Toru's explosive bubblegum ended up being the thing that bailed him out. These guys even managed to grab Inca. And that's despite her premonition ability making that very difficult even for Kadon himself. They were reliable from long range too. Not to mention pre-prepared formations and tactics, and an unwavering belief in Kadon. Really, even if he is your enemy, it's hard not to like Kadon. Rats were his favorite animal since there were always a bunch of them at their hideout. And unlike the strategic masterminds around him, Kadon's day-to-day activities were pretty simple. He took care of the pillars and cooked fish. That's right, Kadon was a fisherman. And that is yet another nod to the fact that he's named after the most famous mythological boatman in history. And it is also another nod to his connection with King Kamehameha, because one of the Hawaiian king's most notable decrees was the Law of Splintered Paddle. Before Kamehameha became king, he caught his foot on a rock during a raid and could not move. He was encountered by two fishermen, but they were very afraid of the warrior and hit him over the head with a huge paddle. And instead of taking him out, the paddle actually broke over his head and they ran away while he was dazed. As a result, more than a decade later, the same fishermen were brought in front of the king. But instead of punishing them, the king blamed himself for attacking innocent people and gave them land. And from then on, the decree was that every elderly person, woman, and child could lie by the roadside in safety. Now, by virtue of how his ignition ability worked, Kadon was at his strongest in his final moments of life. His body was oversaturated by thermal energy and surging with power. When he finally released it, it took everything Maki and Takehisa had just to change its direction. And when it hit Dragon, it forced the nigh-invincible powerhouse far from Earth and into the infinite expanse of space. He ended up next to the moon, so we're talking about a distance of roughly 239,000 miles away. Suffice it to say, Kadon is really cool. Next up, Arrow was the guardian of the third pillar, Sho Kusakabe. This character was an absolute menace early on into the story. Arrow's third generation ignition ability allowed her to form bows and arrows out of flames. And one of the first things we saw Arrow do was kill Rekka so easily, despite the latter being in a room full of capable fire soldiers and encased in a thick block of ice. It all happened so quickly that they literally didn't know what hit them before Arrow shot a second time. And after missing her second shot, Arrow resolved herself to do better. And with that, she destroyed Yan Li's right arm. If it wasn't for that sacrifice, Karim would have certainly died. Arrow's approach to everything in life was as straight and narrow as possible. She didn't mince words, wasn't moved by sentiment in the slightest, and only considered the task at hand. She just wasn't interested in anything else. With the end of the world's approach, this Guardian saw no point in human emotions, and Arrow's attacks were usually too strong to simply be deflected. Maki was forced to transmogrify and redirect one of them, and still managed to suffer considerable damage. Arrow's projectiles might as well have been missiles. They could burn straight through a fire soldier's highly resistant coat. Arrow's vision was especially great, even in very low lighting. She could shoot from such a crazy distance that a target wouldn't even hear the attack coming before being hit. And more than just that, Arrow could change their course at will. These arrows also didn't allow outside forces to influence their trajectory, which is quite a dangerous perk for an expert archer to possess. Although she was nowhere near as fast as Shinra, Arrow's tactical cleverness made that less of an issue. Generally, only the likes of superheated plasma could hope to stop her attacks. And even then, if her attacks were being deflected, then she could just make them explode prematurely instead. And in exchange for some accuracy, Arrow could split her shots into one projectile for each finger, and launch them at the same time. Arrow also had a reputation for never letting her quarry escape. Even so, she did end up losing to Takehisa, since he used the energy from her attacks to supercharge his own. And despite being on opposing sides, these two characters conducted themselves in pretty similar ways. And I'd like to think that Takehisa's slight edge in the ridiculous fool department was what was enough to secure him the win. And after that, Arrow even had some trouble against Maki, but mostly because she was forced to stay within close range for that fight, against a trained grappler and martial artist no less. But Arrow's desire to trigger the apocalypse was just as strong as her desire to follow Sho, a 14-year-old boy who she referred to as Commander. And since he was the pillar of apathy, Arrow was very well suited to serving an emotionally lacking Sho. And because he was abducted as an infant, we can only imagine that she was with him for that long. But as emotions and connections arose for Sho, Arrow struggled to be of use to him. She didn't have any input on the subject, but at the very least, Arrow's loyalty never wavered. Even at the potential cost of the White Clad's ultimate mission and everything that she dedicated her life to, Arrow would follow and serve Commander Sho. Despite her outlook on emotions, the most sentimental thing Arrow said was that a pillar and their guardian are meant to be buddies. She tried to serve as Hamea's guardian for a bit, but the two were a horrible match. Even so, when Hamea read Arrow's mind, the guardian felt curiosity, respect, fear, and awe in her presence. Unlike Karan, Arrow never designated a parental role for herself with Sho. And considering how hardwired personality quirks are in this series, you could even argue that doing or being other than straightforward was impossible for Arrow. But her relationship with Sho and the lengths she was willing to go to for his sake, to me, emphasize the value in presence and desire. Arrow wanted to help Sho, and although she was ill-equipped to do so, simply trying made a world of difference. Joker was the self-proclaimed guardian of the fourth pillar, Shinra Kusakabe. The name Joker obviously points to the Joker playing card, but this moniker of his is also associated with The Joker, a chart-topping album and song that the Steve Miller Band released in the 70s. The song's chorus is pretty much a description of Joker. "Cause I'm a picker, I'm a grinner." Joker has his pick of dance partners throughout the series and almost always had a huge grin on his face. "I'm a lover and I'm a sinner." Joker loved the truth and was willing to do bad things to get to it. "I play my music in the sun." Joker lived on the surface and hell was the second sun. "I'm a joker, I'm a smoker." Joker was a chronic smoker. "I'm a midnight toker." Joker tended to operate at night. "I get my lovin' on the run." Joker was a wanted criminal who always managed to get away. Joker even sung his own rendition of the song during his homecoming tour. But before he was Joker, this otherwise nameless man was labeled 5-2 by the Holy Soul Church. This is a nod to the fact that there are 52 cards in a standard deck of playing cards. When he moved beyond that name, he became something more. After all, the 53rd card is the Joker. It's also his secret weapon. But more on that in a bit. 5-2 was raised by the Holy Soul Shadow, a secret death squad that unquestioningly served the church. Presumably, 5-2 and the other shadows were abducted, abandoned, and orphaned children. The one keepsake 5-2 had of his parents was an old watch. It was stopped at 332, so 5-2 assumed that this was when he was abandoned. 5-2 was noticeably skilled for his age, and stood out amongst his peers. Unfortunately, this deviance from the norm and spark of individuality was seen as unforgivable by his commander. As a result, 5-2 was subject to terrible mental and physical abuse. He was beaten to a pulp. His one connection to his parents was incinerated, and he was violated in the worst ways imaginable. But despite all that, 5-2 never stopped striving for strength. All he wanted in life was to know the truth, to know why the world sucks so much. To do that, he'd need to be strong enough to get answers. In those days, 5-2 fought just like the other shadows and used the same weaponry. These guys didn't operate with individuality in mind. So although ignition abilities tend to vary greatly from person to person, being different was unacceptable. Even so, their standardized fighting style was controlled and coordinated enough to be well suited for dispatching both people and infernals alike. They completely disregarded their own lives for the sake of fulfilling their tasks. Even a ruined arm wasn't enough to make one of these guys hesitate. Each and every shadow was a force to be reckoned with. Too bad they fought Benimaru of all people. By virtue of what he had been through, 5-2 no longer felt fear or respect towards anyone. Even so, shadows were often paired with members of the church. For 5-2, that person was Burns. And it was through his conversation with Burns that 5-2 learned that the surface world was awful too. Although they weren't pillars, 5-2 and Burns were pretty much prophets. They connected to Adolla and saw God. This was an authentic experience that wasn't orchestrated or intended by the church or the White Clad. From there, Shinra's family tragedy ended up saving Joker's life. While the shadows were distracted, 5-2 took the chance to escape. It seems like 5-2 wanted Burns to join him and discover freedom together. but the future captain was too devoted to his faith for that to be possible. When the former Shadow first started living on the surface, he was taken in and fed by a nice family. 5-2 grew up eating moldy food in the Nether, so of course, chicken off the bone immediately became his favorite food. And I promise we're not talking about Minecraft here. 5-2 ran a grocery errand to repay their kindness, but when he came back, the family had been slaughtered by the church. Even if the Shadows couldn't have him back, 5-2's abuser refused to ever let him have a normal life. This only further reinforced 5-2's sentiment about the world sucking and his desperation for the truth about it. He also accepted that he would always be alone. From there, 5-2 became Joker, although he technically wouldn't be given that moniker until after his first meeting with Shinra. Joker's familiarity with the Nether made darkness his playground and natural habitat. Nobody could catch him since he went to where very few people were equipped to follow. And despite his many issues with it, Joker really did love the dark. Down below, instead of his usual formal attire, Joker preferred to wear loungewear. And to speed up his travel time, the guy even had an ignition-powered motorcycle, one that he only seemed to use underground. Joker was the one who proposed a partnership between himself and Victor. As the head of incendiary research, the scientist had access to various things that Joker found useful. Joker's desire for justice was far too vague for such an analytical mind to accept. What sold the deal was their mutual desire for the truth. To Joker, truth is the only brand of justice that is truly equal. And the pun here is that Joker could never get the light to follow him. So instead, he settled for Victor Leaked. As opposed to Company 8's goal of ending spontaneous combustion, these two simply wanted answers. They had no intentions of becoming heroes. Instead, they saw themselves as anti-heroes. They had a secret base that was located inside of an abandoned sewer. And thankfully, the base itself was well ventilated. It was totally forgotten and didn't show up on any maps. Funny enough, there was a big no smoking sign by the door. So while Joker didn't ditch his cigarette, he also wouldn't light up in there. The most Joker could hope for in life was a decent education. Yet he ended up with one of the smartest people in the series. And Joker himself was definitely on that list too. In each of the fights he was involved in or observed, Joker studied the battlefield and situation. He pointed out various things about the abilities of others and was very well aware of his own capabilities and limitations. Thanks to his past and driving desire, Joker was very well informed about various secretive subjects. So of course, Joker had many secrets of his own, especially when it came to his ignition ability. First of all, his generation was labeled as unknown. But knowing the rules of the series, he was either a second generation or a third generation pyrokinetic. And from what I can tell, Joker had second generation abilities. But he was also a sketchy dealer with plenty of tricks up his sleeves. So he had to keep you guessing. Again, the Shadows were expected to be as similar to one another as possible. And if that's the case, then it's hard to believe that they would include the inherently unique abilities of the third generation. Victor was the foremost expert on ignition abilities and didn't have any of his own. By teaming up with him, Joker gained access to plenty of special tools. Tools that helped him blur the generational lines like Hadon's ability did. Joker's primary weapon of choice was his flammable deck of cards. And these cards were very versatile. He used them for offense and defense, from both long and even short ranges. He also had techniques that were named after card-related terms. Four of a Kind was strong enough to force a Stage 2 Captain Burns back and made him grit his teeth. For utility, Joker used cigarettes as if they were torches, and he could manipulate the smoke or flames to be a means of communication. But he also liked to shape flames in general, which is another indicator that Joker was a second generation. Since the first time we saw him, he manipulated the flames after they were ignited, and everyone in Company 8 assumed it was Maki, their second generation user. And we also saw Joker light his cigarette with a swipe of his finger. Now, something like that would normally be a sign of third generation powers, but it's more likely to be a function of the item itself, just a bit of smoke and mirrors to keep others guessing. and we actually saw him ignite his cards with it. Victor also cooked up some infernal ashes for Joker to work with. It was an effective explosive, but was never really used offensively. The powder was really intended to give Joker a way to escape. Overall, Joker was quite strong, and made up for his shortcomings with underhanded tools and tactics. But sadly, we never got a chance to see Joker go all out. Although he managed to cut down his abuser, Joker didn't play his trump card. He planned on saving it for a fight against Burns. But since Benimaru was backing Joker up, Burns surrendered immediately. However, Joker eventually fought Burns alongside Shinra, and still didn't go all out. He also knew they wouldn't be able to beat Burns at stage 2 or beyond. The fact that he knew the man's ability so well just goes to show how closely they once worked together. Now, Joker was most definitely a gambler. A typical day for him included finding good targets to gamble with. He certainly wasn't afraid of risks, but never did anything without a solid chance at success. So whatever this trump card of his was, it must have been swift enough to beat Captain Burns before he could really heat up. And his odds of victory, even against one of the strongest captains, had to be decent. With all these things in mind, I'm inclined to believe that Joker's final card involved Hellfire. Because Joker no longer felt respect or fear towards others, not even the sight of God was enough for him to lose his wits. Thanks to that, he actually brought a piece of hell back with him. Between holding that and having an eye incinerated at the same time, this guy's pain tolerance was insane. Joker kept it for over a decade and it never stopped burning, even without oxygen. And it looks like this thing was in their hideout. Do you really think a scientist like Victor would just ignore that? Thanks to Shinra, we saw that Hellfire was powerful enough to actually hurt Karon, the same guy who smiled when Benimaru hit him. But that form of Hellfire was spontaneous and momentary. The Hellfire Joker had was an eternal version of that. Shinra tried to use Hellfire against Burns, but the captain was already at stage 3 by then, so it was already too late. If these deductions are true, then I can totally understand why Joker would hesitate to use and let that Hellfire spread. Honestly, in my first read of the story, I thought this piece of hell might have been a way for Amaterasu to eventually be freed. I mean, come on, an eternal flame from hell totally sounded like a promising power source. But it never came up again. Joker had something he called a Shadow Dweller's intuition. He could just tell when a person was a shining light with a positive impact on others. It's what he saw in Captain Obi and what he saw in Shinra. Joker tried to recruit Shinra early on during the rookie games. He was definitely stronger than Shinra back then, but clearly avoiding lethal blows. Joker was just testing the kid, because the pillar would need to be strong for what Joker planned to do. He threatened to kill innocent people, but that was just an act to get Shinra invested. Despite his many team-ups on the surface, Joker never aligned himself with bad people ever again. By telling Shinra that his little brother Sho was still alive, Joker expected the Fire Soldier's curiosity to become a burning desire for the truth. He was right on that front, but underestimated Shinra's faith in Fire Company 8. Joker didn't know the Company 8 was meant to investigate the other 7. He only found out after the event. So despite the allure, there was no reason for Shinra to gamble with a sketchy guy like Joker. They were only pushed in Joker's direction after Victor joined them and the entire group became outlaws. Heading into the fight against Burns, Joker offered to be Shinra's guardian. Shinra refused, but that was mostly because he believed he was too strong to need one. Although, when Joker brought up Benimaru, the pillar knew that he wouldn't stand a chance. That said, it's not like the other pillars had much of a choice either. Haumea and Sho were still in diapers when they met their guardians, and Inka seems to have gained her guardian on the same day that she met her. And although Shinra was definitely stronger than Joker by then, all of the pillars were either generally or temporarily far stronger than their respective guardians. Although Joker had to sit out at some point after fighting alongside Shinra, he still supported and kept the kid standing afterwards. He also reminded Shinra of his objective at a critical time. It's unclear what exactly Joker decided to do after Shinra saved the world, but after learning the whole truth, he was happily reunited with Captain Burns for the epilogue. But while Joker's guardian position is debatable, Arthur Boyle is the undeniable guardian of the fourth pillar, Shinra Kusakabe. Arthur grew up as the only child of his restaurant-owning parents. After an especially bad food poisoning incident, the family racked up a pretty huge debt. And while they were dealing with that, the restaurant caught fire and all their savings went up in smoke. Thanks to that, the family was bound for starvation. Ahead of their final meal, Arthur found his dad staring into his own hat. His father claimed to be stargazing across the universe. But when Arthur checked, it was pitch black. His father asked if he was sure about that. Then Arthur's imagination took over. Despite their circumstances, Arthur's family did own a television, a special Nintendo, and a copy of Dragon Question, an obvious parody of the Super Nintendo game console and the game Dragon Quest. These things were actually pretty rare and considered ancient pre-cataclysm technology. As a result, Arthur imagined that he was the son of a king with a huge castle and plenty of soldiers. Arthur's parents fed into his imagination by telling him that they would be hosting a grand ball. Instead of a final supper consisting of mackerel and rice, Arthur saw a grand feast fit for a king. He was mesmerized as their tiny apartment became a sprawling ballroom. But when Arthur woke up, his parents were gone. Before leaving, they left him a note. They claimed to be going on a journey to save the world. They entrusted him with their castle and named him the new king. So instead of remembering these events as the day his parents abandoned him, Arthur saw it as the day he became the Night King. Arthur fully embraced his role and sought to protect his realm by also becoming a fire soldier. And we can only assume that Arthur lost that castle of his in no time. Thankfully, he considered anywhere he stayed, like Fire Cathedral 8, to be a castle. At the academy, Arthur was the one who first approached Shinra. Because the boy desired to be a hero, he was exactly the sort of person that Arthur wanted to be around. Arthur, Shinra, and Ogun became fast friends and were the top 3 prospects of their school. In those days, Arthur got all the girls. They admired his chivalry and confidence, and overall just thought he was cute. Shinra, on the other hand, who never had that sort of luck, was pretty jealous. Arthur himself would be interested in any girl who claimed to be a princess. Which is why the first thing he asked Maki and Iris was if they were princesses. Since they weren't, Arthur never looked at them romantically. Which to me is yet again another missed opportunity for Hibana, the so-called Captain Princess. But before long, the alien Yona infiltrated the academy and provoked a jealous hater to spread devilish rumors about Shinra. The trauma-fueled scrutiny really got to him and triggered his uncomfortable smile, which only made things worse. But that wasn't exactly what caused a rift between him and Arthur. One day, Arthur and Shinra were at a park, and some kids asked them which was better, heroes or knights. That ignited a feud between them that went on for years. Shinra argued that knights were just a subcategory of heroes. So from then on, Arthur made sure to specify that he is a Night King. And generally, whenever Arthur didn't have a solid response, he resorted to a wise and knowing scoff. But during that inciting argument, the two went too far with their insults. Shinra called Arthur a fool, which was the ultimate insult to a king and is especially relevant to the lore of the world. More on that later. In response, Arthur said the worst thing he could. He called Shinra a devil. And hearing that from Arthur cut deeper than any other source. After that, Ogun became Shinra's only friend, while Arthur became his rival. Arthur continued to call Shinra a devil for years. But to play King's advocate, Arthur didn't actually mean it in the same way that everyone else did. Think about it from Arthur's perspective. Instead of just being based on the first installment, Dragon Question seems to be based on the Dragon Quest franchise in general. We know this because despite the first Dragon Quest lacking a party system, Arthur was keenly aware of the traditional 4-party setup, and the mechanics of the game allowed him to focus buffs from party members onto the hero. In the world of Dragon Quest, demons are just another humanoid race. They aren't inherently evil, but tend to have a pretty rough past. I know devils and demons aren't always the same thing, but we have seen the terms be used interchangeably in a conversation between these guys before. To Arthur, Shinra was pretty much just a troublesome party member. Now, Arthur was a third-generation pyrokinetic who wielded the power to produce plasma. This was an exceptionally rare ability. With such high-temperature flames, not even second-generation users could manipulate them. In most cases, Arthur projected his plasma from his weapon of choice, Excalibur. While second-generation fire soldiers usually carried around tons of equipment, Excalibur was all that Arthur really needed. The weapon itself was actually just a bit of high-temperature carbon, which Arthur got from a hardware store. Although, from Arthur's perspective, they were more like a clan of dwarven blacksmiths. Arthur's use of plasma made him the perfect counter against Hamea's electricity. His brain was totally unaffected by her electrical signals. By crossing her signals, Arthur could stop her power from hitting a person's nervous system. She also couldn't send signals to others while he was around. With enough power, Arthur could even cause a sort of massive plasma-based EMP effect. This resulted in blackouts and a major shutdown of Hamea's influence on others. Arthur could be described as both a genius and an idiot. Like Joker, Arthur didn't really care for authority figures, mostly because, as king, he saw himself as above their stations. It's why he initially ignored Captain Obi's order for them to hide their weapons. And when he temporarily joined Company 2, Arthur demanded their fealty and disregarded their lieutenant. Company 8 had to make a special Arthur Boyle care manual to teach other fire companies how to deal with him. Thankfully, the Night King was open to sound wisdom and counsel. Despite his obvious skill, Arthur was a terrible student since he didn't care for anything taught in the classroom. Thanks to that, he didn't understand his own ignition ability for a good while. Ogun was the one who had to do a ton of research to figure it out. Arthur's mind was similar to the properties of plasma in the sense that his strength depended on his circumstances. Atoms consist of a nucleus and electrons. Plasma is a result of separating said electrons from the nucleus. This makes it far more unstable and susceptible to change. So Arthur's power was just as unstable and depended on how knightly he was feeling. If he didn't feel knightly, then he couldn't use his powers. This made him pretty reliant on his weapon of choice, since his mental image of a knight included a mighty sword. Arthur is meant to remind us that our perception becomes our reality. Regardless of how absurd others may have found his behavior, Arthur always stayed true to himself. With just a bit of convincing, Arthur's firepower would skyrocket. Arthur perpetually lived in his own reality. His belief was so strong that it even continued while he was asleep. Under the right circumstances, Arthur was able to casually fend off an attack from Shinra with one arm. And we're talking about an all-out kick that nearly made Ogun buckle even with Pan's physical buff on him. Arthur, with a bit of knightly flair, was on the same level as Shinra in the midst of an Adolla burst. In fact, Arthur was stronger. He held back the entire time and even resorted to hand-to-hand combat instead of Excalibur. The fact that Arthur held back and even gave Shinra multiple chances is a true testament to how much he cared about the guy. Because as king, Arthur did not hesitate to do difficult things. He had no trouble striking the killing blows against Infernals since his very first mission. And he did so while Shinra himself was unsettled by the act. The first time he encountered Hamea, Arthur immediately went for the head. He cut down the former captain of Company 3, Giovanni, without a second thought. And when he first met Dragon, he made sure to aim for the heart. Even without Excalibur, Arthur had his own knightly martial art known as the Avalon Stance. Shinra refused to call Arthur his friend, but Arthur never made that sort of declaration. Words aside, their actions towards one another told a whole different story. Arthur and Shinra ate food together all the time. When Shinra was offered food, Arthur managed to insert himself into the arrangement. This was so frequent that Shinra even knew about Arthur's habit of claiming the head of the table like he owned the position. And if there wasn't a seat like that, then he usually just sat next to Shinra. They even ate Chinese dirt together. At Fire Cathedral 8, they shared a room and were bunkmates, with Shinra handling all the cleaning. When they went to Company 1 together, their beds were side by side. They sat next to each other in the Matchbox 2. They trained together, planned together, and flew together. They picked up Asakusa slang together and had new nicknames for each other. Arthur was even there for Shinra's very first Adolla Link. Suffice it to say that Arthur always managed to involve himself in anything that had to do with Shinra. Despite his claims that knights only take orders from princesses, Arthur still did things for Shinra whenever he asked. For all their bickering, Arthur and Shinra were inseparable and like the brother that the other always needed. Arthur knew Shinra better than anyone. When Shinra wasn't himself for 3 months, Arthur was the only one who could tell the difference immediately. He deeply respected Shinra's convictions and desired to become a hero despite his devilish disposition. They both made vows in the name of their families, something that Arthur always reminded Shinra of whenever he veered away from that path. Arthur was unlike any of the other Guardians because he never babied his pillar. Instead of what he may have wanted to hear, Arthur always told Shinra what he needed to hear. He reprimanded Shinra's unsavory behavior, but always supported his noble pursuits. He knew that Shinra's attraction towards Iris stemmed from his longing for a motherly figure, and Iris happened to be the only one who could tell how profound the friendship between Arthur and Shinra really was. When they first entered the Nether, Arthur already knew that Shinra would be scared, while he himself was unfazed and even eager. On the flip side, Shinra had a solid understanding of Arthur's mental limitations. So in many cases, Arthur would turn to Shinra for his brainpower. Yet for all his idiocy, Arthur managed to recognize pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, before a genius like Victor did. This is because Arthur studied and admired anything that had to do with knights and kings. And in many cases, he was too dumb to discern what was actually related to them and what wasn't. Pi is related to circles, and Arthur decided to study n, or roundness, because of the Entaku, or round table, as in the famous Knights of Camelot. Beyond pi's millionth digit, the string 34102515 appears in pi at least 3 times. Arthur used a mnemonic device called Pilish to mentally link the length of certain words to corresponding digits of pi. So he remembered 34102515 as the king, a mythologized ruler o' lands. But despite all that, Arthur still didn't know what pi even was. And on that note, Arthur studied all manner of kings, even the king of games from Yu-Gi-Oh! While Arthur certainly didn't remember everything, he always kept the gist of kingly and knightly decorum in mind. Even when the entire matchbox was flipped in the air by dominions, Arthur was the only one who was totally unfazed. In the same vein, Arthur taught himself how to clear his mind entirely as a means of avoiding mental detection. We saw him tap into this state after getting high on wasteland fumes. Arthur studied the Buddhist practice of anatta, or non-self. The concept stresses the impermanence of all things, including human souls. In recognizing that there is no self, a person may approach enlightenment. By achieving enlightenment, a person may separate themselves from the pains of the world and enter nirvana. A bodhisattva is someone who has achieved this but has not moved on to nirvana. Instead, they remain on Earth as a guide for others. In doing so, they may become indistinguishable from, and at times even surpass, the gods themselves. This stuff has nothing to do with knights, but has everything to do with Arthur. Because he so firmly believed in things that others said did not and could not exist, Arthur was labeled a fool. Yet in such a terrible world, one with the constant fear of spontaneous human combustion and his own childhood abandonment, Arthur enjoyed each and every moment of his life. He was unshackled and free from pain. His extreme delusions kept him from ever feeling down. And even if he heard something he didn't like, the Night King would just shut it out like a stubborn 4-year-old. And that outlook allowed him to become one of the strongest beings in existence. But we'll get to that soon enough. Arthur's senses were downright ridiculous. And for a while, his kinetic eyesight was actually a little too good. He could pick up on the slightest of movements and react accordingly. It's why, despite Sho's ability to stop time, Arthur could still make a move before it went into effect. and also why he was so good at stopping projectiles from the likes of Arrow, and even the absurd speed of Hamea's electricity. Unfortunately, this capability made Arthur very susceptible to feints and tricks. It's why Maki was able to get the better of him at the beginning of the series. To fix this, Benimaru taught him how to search for the breath of life, and from then on, even with his eyes closed, Arthur could acutely sense all life forms around him. He became totally immune to illusions and disguises. In honing this ability and studying Japanese swordplay, Arthur dubbed himself a Knight Samurai, and thought of it as multi-classing. But he switched it around to Samurai Knight to make sure his priorities were in order. Eventually, Arthur forgot the order again, and when Shinra pointed it out, Arthur told him to stop saying dumb things. Arthur even decided to change his class from Knight to Assassin when the situation called for it. But a bit of criticism from Shinra made him quickly switch back, which is actually a bit of a shame. Arthur came equipped with a mini Excalibur just for lockpicking, and before then, we learned that Arthur was surprisingly good with his hands. As an assassin, Arthur probably would have gone for a stealth build. Even before he used non-self, Benimaru noted that Arthur's attempt to hit him was actually impressive, minus the call-out. And when all of Fire Company 8 fought the strongest captain, Arthur's attack was the only one that Benimaru actually decided to dodge. After he and Shinra fought Benimaru for 5 hours straight, Arthur managed to unlock hysterical strength by imagining that his Dragon Question save file was deleted. Hysterical strength was very dependent on the user having an active imagination, and Arthur's was stronger than anyone else's. Thanks to his signature move, Violet Flash, which became one of his monikers, Arthur was easily one of the fastest characters around. Even early on, Arthur was nothing to play with. He fought a special Infernal who maintained his serial killer personality and was further enhanced by drugs from Fire Company 5. Arthur withstood several hits from the juiced up monster, and ended up one-shotting him without even trying. The only reason he was hit, and the fight lasted so long, was because Arthur was so dumb that he was wielding Excalibur in the wrong hand. After that, he made sure to actively distinguish between his left and right by remembering which hand he held his chopsticks with. Later, Arthur also managed to one-shot Stream the Gale, and that guy was on the same level as Gold. Gold, who was able to brutalize the majority of Fire Company 8 by her lonesome. And like Gold, Stream was a specialist when it came to dealing with fire-resistant pyrokinesis. Gale nearly killed Takahisa in an instant, but was no match at all for Arthur. But Arthur meant more than his match in the form of Dragon the Destroyer. As the Night King, it was only natural for Arthur to dream of slaying a mighty dragon one day. And mighty he was indeed. By simply exhaling, Dragon produced a shockwave that was strong enough to send Maki and Takahisa flying. Impressively, Arthur was the only one who stood firm. Dragon's presence indulged Arthur's fantasy outlook more than any other opponent. As a result, Excalibur was supercharged like never before. Violet Flash Death to Dragons was the strongest attack the Night King had ever performed, but it didn't so much as scratch or even phase the man-shaped disaster. And when Arthur took a calamitous hit, he didn't so much as flinch. Instead, he locked in and managed to expertly reduce the damage. Dragon distinguishing himself as something other than human made Arthur literally shake with excitement and grow even stronger. Every time Dragon proudly proclaimed his own name, Arthur got stronger. But the power differential between them was still too great. Even when Arthur dodged, Dragon's presence alone was enough to make the fire soldier's nose bleed. Despite this, Arthur only distanced himself from his opponent when doing so gave him an opportunity to counterattack. With that, Dragon couldn't help but acknowledge the young man's masterful use of fire. Still, Arthur was the only one taking damage. Dragon simply blowing air in Arthur's direction was more powerful than the overwhelming majority of attacks in the series. And to defend himself, Arthur used Plasmantle, a defensive projection of plasma in the form of a billowing cape. This was the most focused Arthur had ever been. But according to Dragon, Arthur was still only using half of his true power since he had yet to fully grasp Adolla. Dragon had the ability to infernalize parts of his body. Arthur recontextualized this as the infamous dragon suit, the inner dragon possessing his outer dragon. Once that happened, Arthur became even stronger and wielded the dragon-vanquishing Holy Sword. Unfortunately, Dragon destroyed Excalibur before the blow could be struck, barely missing the boy's vitals. The Night King had been defeated. After that, Arthur was at his absolute lowest. Despite the edicts of kingly decorum, Arthur didn't even bother fixing up his hair and began to wallow. Vulcan was the one who helped Arthur get out of his rut. Vulcan was pretty much like an older brother to Arthur. As a bit of a fool himself, Vulcan knew how to make the most out of Arthur's outlook on the world and decided to forge him a brand new Excalibur. During their crafting adventure, Arthur came to some seemingly stupid conclusions that, in hindsight, were actually brilliant. When a shop owner kept repeating the scripted lines that Vulcan gave him, Arthur discerned that some people in the world are just NPCs, like in video games. And even when a little girl asked the fire soldier to rescue her cat from a tree, Arthur refused to accept any side quests while he was on the main quest. Again, this might sound dumb and horrible, but Arthur was clearly onto something, because later we learned that he was actually right. The masses and background characters of the story literally didn't matter. The fire company's efforts to save innocent civilians was totally pointless and had no impact on the fate of the world. A background character literally erased his own mother from the story when he realized the truth. So yeah, Arthur's instincts were so good that he was inherently aware of how the metafiction of his world worked. Ultimately, Arthur felt more than he thought, which seems to be a trait he inherited from his parents. His instincts pushed him towards the Nether, and that's where he reunited with them. Apparently, they sensed him too. To escape their debt collectors, Arthur's parents fled into the Nether. They collected tons of pre-cataclysm artifacts like Arthur's game and console that most people had never even seen or heard about. They also knew almost every major bit of information about spontaneous human combustion and the White Clad, information that took the fire companies ages to figure out. They learned all of this thanks to the fact that Arthur's dad was a prophet who could see into the future. And among their many artifacts was the payload fairing of a space rocket. Made of a special aluminum alloy with heat-treated coating, the material could withstand extreme temperatures with ease. And Arthur's interpretation made it even better. To him, it was a fragment of a star. Just imagine wielding a fraction of the sun's power as a pyrokinetic. The new Excalibur was far stronger than the previous, and with such power and skill behind it, there was nothing that Arthur couldn't cut down, except for Dragon. Arthur's Violet Flash became so fast that he could use mid-air debris created by Dragon's onslaught as footholds, and not even Dragon could keep track of his high-speed movements. But although Arthur fared better than he had previously, he was still no match for Dragon. However, Arthur knew exactly what he needed to do to gain the power he needed to win. And yet again, he would need Vulcan's assistance for what would be his greatest trial yet, because it turns out that Vulcan was Arthur's Merlin all along, the legendary magician and mentor. Arthur needed Vulcan's help to beat Dragon Question since he was too dumb to do it on his own. And as ridiculous as it might sound, the very fate of the world depended on it. When they were done, Earth was closer to Adolla than ever, so Arthur's delusions became closer to reality. Thanks to this, he was able to use the zoom spell from Dragon Quest to fast travel. Arthur's precision and senses were so heightened that he was able to use Excalibur like a gamma knife to surgically remove the Giovanni parasite in Yu's brain in an instant. And he inherently understood the importance of his fight against Dragon. It turns out that the Destroyer's immense despair was accelerating the death of the world at an alarming rate. And man, Arthur vs. Dragon Round 3 was the greatest fight in Fire Force, bar none. They kicked things off in a newly manifested volcanic region where 3 of the things were overflowing and in close proximity. Fun fact, the closest humanity's come to a fiery apocalypse was about 74,000 years ago. The eruption of the Mount Toba supervolcano was the largest natural disaster in the last 2.5 million years, and is said to have reduced our species to less than 10,000 people. From the outset, Arthur managed to push Dragon back and give him his very first taste of pain. Which is to say, that a strike from Arthur's sword was literally more powerful than the strongest missile strike humanity had to offer. After being launched into the storm clouds above, Arthur channeled the lightning into Excalibur. This was Violet Flash Reverse Plunge. And finally, Dragon had been cut. And after seeing his own blood for once, Dragon decided to truly fight for a change. Arthur was so locked in that he casually defied logic. He had no trouble standing on storm clouds and even spoke and coughed underwater. The clash of their attacks rended the heavens and shattered the earth. Dragon actually had to raise his hands in defense for once, and no matter how hard he was hit, Arthur did not back down. After shoving Dragon into the storm, Arthur channeled its power again to carve into the behemoth with Violet Flash Octo Strike. This created a chasm in the clouds and made Dragon lose a lot of blood. So, he kicked it up a notch with his Infernal Dragon armor. Excalibur could shoot plasma like a beam attack and still had plenty more power to give. The planet itself could not contain the magnitude of their fight. So, they took their battle into outer space. And it turns out that this is why Arthur's dad always saw stars inside his hat. Instead of seeing the future, he was seeing Arthur's future all along. But once they were on the moon, Arthur had a serious problem. Unawareness made him immune to many of the dangers associated with the location. But even Arthur knew that you're not supposed to be able to breathe on the moon. So he began to suffocate. Thankfully, Vulcan also made a ring for Arthur to use in case of emergency. It was made of the same material as Excalibur, but otherwise, there was nothing special about it. Arthur's imagination made it a crazy power-up that converted the thoughts of everyone on Earth into power. He imagined a game notification about the ring being equipped, and the pixels actually became footholds. These guys proceeded to go head-to-head until they struck mutually lethal blows. Arthur sensed a major opening and severed Dragon's hand. In exchange, Dragon destroyed one of Arthur's eyes. But the Night King didn't even blink. He pierced through Dragon's chest, but ended up losing a hand of his own to a breath attack. From there, Arthur went beyond the press of death. He became even stronger through his readiness for death, but this would only afford him one final attack, one that Arthur sacrificed his lower half to deliver, the ultimate sword strike that was further empowered by Dragon's own attack. Violet Earth Cleaver extended from the moon and cut the Earth in half. This was the light of hope itself, and with it, Dragon had finally been slain, and his despair was totally purged. With his dying breath, Arthur shouted at Shinra to quit playing the devil and save the world already. From there, he accepted his end with a smile and drifted towards the sun. And even then, this legend didn't even die. When Shinra's devilish behavior triggered the end of the world, Arthur shot a beam from the depths of space to scold him. Twice! This was the moment when Hameya realized that Arthur was Shinra's guardian all along. Now, strangely, Arthur was fully dressed and all of his limbs were intact. This is because of Arthur's perspective on death. In Arthur's mind, he was no different from a video game character. And in video games, you can die plenty of times and tend to come back with all of your equipment. Instead of thinking that it was the end of the road, Arthur just figured that it would take him a while to recover. Again, as a Bodhisattva, Arthur was the only living being left when Shinra and Hameya ascended to godhood. And once it was all over, Shinra couldn't wait for his best friend to return. When Shinra Banshoman remade the world, he made all of Arthur's many delusions a reality, and that includes Excalibur. Excalibur was also made with the love that Vulcan, Yu, and Lisa shared, so his humanoid form was based on the dirty old doll that Yu used to carry around. And like his wielder, Excalibur considered "fool" to be the ultimate insult and always used it. Excalibur was a great old one because besides being the inspiration behind the demon weapon race, he was the embodiment of Arthur's madness. So Arthur was the world's first Meister, and is the reason Excalibur is the world's strongest weapon, and totally insufferable. Ritsu was the guardian of the fifth pillar, Inca. This member of the White Clad was the least prominent guardian in the story, and her relationship with her pillar was mostly superficial. But while it took a while for her to make her first appearance, the effects of her power were felt in the story very early on. Ritsu considered herself to be a maid and treated Inka like a princess. She enjoyed tending to housework and sewing, but hated society and frequently checked the death reports. This was mostly due to her pyrokinetic ability, Necropyro. With it, Ritsu was able to reanimate hordes of infernals and control them like puppets. Besides operating like zombies that were way too fast, they tended to grab hold of people before blowing themselves up, and anyone they killed would be added to their numbers. It didn't matter how long a person had been dead for, but newer bodies were more capable of harnessing combat abilities that they had in life. Ritsu could create giant infernals by fusing several of them together, and she liked to sift around looking for top-grade materials to use as a base. Trained fighters yielded the best results. Besides being far stronger, giant infernals were also harder to kill since they had multiple cores. And if they were fused around a living person, that person would become an embedded hostage. These things weren't as tough as a demon, but were still very durable. Ritsu could control dozens of infernals of varying sizes with ease, and her ability to do so certainly wasn't based on sight. We never saw Ritsu's eyes since they were always covered by her bangs. The White Clad had a tradition of eye coverings, but for the necromancer maid of the underworld, it was a bit deeper. Ritsu's favorite animals were bats. They strive in the darkness and have terrible vision, just like her. They're also notorious carriers of disease, which reflects her zombie-making powers. Unfortunately, Ritsu fell into total obscurity once the world connected to Adolla. The doppelganger invasion made her infernals pretty irrelevant, and she was completely absent from the epilogue. So despite Inka becoming the world's first witch and having a son with Shinra, her guardian was the only one with zero follow-up. Which is a bit of a shame, since I could totally see her necromantic practices having an influence on Stein and his eventual zombification of Sid. Yuichiro Kurono, the Ashen Reaper, otherwise known as Death, was the guardian of the sixth pillar, Nataku Son. This self-proclaimed corporate slave had a penchant for preying on the weak. He was said to be strong enough to easily be Captain Caliber, and even close to Benimaru's level of power, although that last bit was an exaggeration. Even still, this sicko opted to stay with Haijima Industries so he could bully children for a living. His appetite for predation was so great that he ruined his own arm by way of teperosis, which is when a third-generation pyrokinetic uses too much of their body's oxygen and overheats to the point of charring. So instead of producing flames, Kurono manipulated ash and smoke. Because his smoke was linked to his five senses, he could pick up on the faintest vibrations. So adapting to something as high speed as Shinra's rapid was simple for him. He could solidify and wield his smoke in the form of various weapons. He had kunai, tanto, a scythe, a kageyari, and a katana. Their sizes could be manipulated at will, with his katana becoming longer than most skyscrapers. Really, his smoke could take on any shape in a blink, from monstrous claws to multi-headed dragons. Once inhaled, Kurono's smoke could incinerate a person from the inside out. And even if they didn't breathe his smoke in, it could seep into any openings or cracks in a body to do the very same thing. Kurono also used his smoke for flight. Based on his weapon choices and use of hand seals, the madman seemed to adhere to Japanese traditions, similarly to Benimaru and the people of Asakusa. Kurono mostly played with his food, but when he really tried, the sclera of his eyes would darken. He became Nataku's guardian thanks to their one-of-a-kind relationship. Unlike everyone else in his life, Kurono wanted nothing more than for Nataku to be a normal kid. This was for the sake of being able to abuse his weakness, but Nataku didn't mind that part. Kurono was an absolute sicko who saw nothing wrong with his way of life, and even considered himself to be good-natured. Although he enjoyed picking on weaklings, he always did so within the parameters of his job, which is to say that all of his bullying was socially approved. After Shinra changed the world, Kurono went on to be a school teacher for Nataku and Sho. But like Arthur, Kurono would also become somewhat related to one of the Great Old Ones. While Benimaru was said to be the strongest, Kurono was known as the maddest. And madness is especially important to the world of Soul Eater. His path in life somewhat came at the expense of his own body. He was closely associated with death and even referred to as Uncle Death. He spent his life fighting children. He had the slanted eyes of a monster. And while he himself didn't have a desire to leave the path of humanity, there is no doubt that all of these parallels point to the fact that the Kishin Ashura was one of his descendants. But there you have it, guys, the most thorough breakdown of the Guardians on the internet. And I really hope you enjoyed it because this took ages. As always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.